All right. What's up, YouTube? So, for those of you who don't know, yesterday we got the thrilling announcement that Yorion was going to be banned in Modern. So, I wanted to do a voiceover the first league I played after the Yorion banning. Didn't have time to stream yesterday, but had time to play through a league later in the night. So, I just wanted to give some play by play of that one and maybe kind of get a little insight on this post Yorion ban world. See kind of where Shadow stands now. So first off, what does the Yorion ban mean for us? Realistically, I don't think it means a whole lot. My theory is that this is going to mean the convergence of a lot of 4-color pile decks. Like, for the past few months, we've dealt with 4 and 5 color pile, especially now 5 color pile with leyline binding. But a lot of pile decks that have had a core theme of like Wrenn and 6 to Fairy, Omnath, some number of pitch elementals, prismatic ending, something like that. And then the other slots in the deck, the other 30-ish, maybe not that many, 25-ish cards, have kind of had their own sub theme. You'd have like a graveyard sub theme with Traverse the Ulvenwald, Unholy Heat, Mishra's Bauble, maybe Emrakul, something like that, Soul of Windgrace, whatever. You'd have an elemental heavy package with like Risen Reef, Solitudes, Endurances in the main. You'd have a control package with more like counter spells and Ice Fang Coatls and all that sort of stuff. Or maybe you had a version that's Planeswalker heavy with like Planebound Accomplice, the 6 mana, I guess it's Vivian that combos with the Accomplice to go off through like Karmic Guys and Kiki Jiki and whatnot. So you had a lot of these different variations that fell under that same like 4 or 5 color pile heading. I think what we're going to see is a lot of those converging down to like 4 color, 5 color elementals, with Kahira still as an available companion since Gigantha rules out like Solitude and Fury, and I think those cards are too important to the archetype. But if we see more Kahira at 60 cards with just like Wrenn and 6 to Fairy, Omnath, Pitch Elementals, stuff like that, then that's at least my theory, is we're going to see like some of those variations get narrowed down a lot. But only time will tell. Ultimately, like your creativity decks, your Rhinos decks are still going to have a lot of the same staying power. They might not have those extra 10, 15 card slots devoted to like extra interaction or whatever that sub theme was, but they're still going to pack a pretty good wallop. So don't think that those decks have died off by any stretch of the imagination. But my attempt at kind of approaching the format recently has been that of somebody who has leaned heavily into counter spells, which you can definitely see in the list that I ran last night. So I added in a 3rd copy of Spell Pierce to the main, additional way to fight like Wrenn and 6s and Teferis, stuff like that. Also really good against a bunch of opposing Blood Moons running around. I've got counter spells in here, full 4 counter spells. Obviously, with Grixis Shadow, a lot of people have been playing Gigantha recently, and my opinion of it is I recognize that Gigantha is going to be really good against like some of your Blood Moon matchups and stuff like that. But I've been messing around with Murktide in the Shadow deck, which I know a lot of people did when Murktide first came out, and we just never got like a solid configuration. But I've been wanting to approach that theory again with the idea that Murktide allows us to have like a big evasive body that gets over like dwarf tokens out of creativity, flies over Yawgmoth, the Undying creatures, presents a significant clock, blocks things with a hammer out of hammer time, wins the shadow mirrors by going over the top. So this has been kind of the driving force behind a lot of my decisions for the last few weeks. So definitely not enough to really pull a lot of significant data from, but it's worth going over. I think the plan has some merit. I found a lot of times where Drown in the Lock's been in hand and hasn't been countering what I wanted to counter recently. I've been less concerned with the removal side of Drown. Since I've got like Lightning Bolts, Unholy Heats, I'm up on my number of Terminates for opposing Murktides. So if Drown in the Lock like isn't, if I don't care about it being a removal spell and it's not countering what I want to counter, then the best solution in my eyes is to replace it with something that is going to counter what I want to counter, which fortunately Modern Horizons gave us a beautiful counter spell into the format. And if we're going for this double blue pit card, which means we can't play Gigante anyway, then why not swap out our top end a little bit for these Murktides? So the rest of the list, essentially, if you replace the Thought Seizes with Considers and the Shadows with Dragon's Rage Channelers, you would have blue-red Murktide. I mean, there's a few differences, like the Terminates would be Archmage's Charms. The third Spell Pierce would be like a fourth Unholy Heat. But for the most part, deck's almost identical. And as such, we kind of play out in a very similar manner. We're really trying to play that tempo game instead of trying to play like the hyper-aggressive shadow game. But the actual counter spells and the extra Spell Pierce allow us to do that. Allow us to be a little more interactive in the first few turns with the stack instead of needing to interact with the board and put pressure on the ground and help clear out the way. Now we get to spend more time stopping things from coming down in the first place. So a lot of the card decisions you've come to know, come to love over the last few months. It's like 4 Ragavan, 4 Shadow, 4 Thoughtseize, 4 Counterspell, 4 Expressive Iteration. Really the core choices of the deck. To surround that, the 3 Spell Pierces, like I said, I want to fight a little bit more in the first 2 or 3 turns over things on the stack. So like Wrenn and 6, Teferi, Creativity, Blood Moon, Scam Effects, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, anything like that in the first few turns. I like that extra piece of interaction against 3 Lightning Bolt and 3 Unholy Heat. Could very well be 4 Unholy Heat, but I really like the reach out of Lightning Bolt. There's not a lot in the format that Unholy Heat kills that Bolt doesn't, outside of like Primeval Titan, sometimes opposing Murktides, but we've got Terminates in the main to kind of deal with some of those things. So really, Unholy Heat is like another copy of Lightning Bolt on turn 1. Helps us deal with like opposing Ragavans and things like that, but has a little bit of flexibility as you get towards the mid to late game. No copies of Dragon's Rage Channeler. So I know that's a decision that I'm sure a lot of people are going to be against and want to find room for Channeler. But Channeler has pretty consistently been the card that I board out the most. I find myself in like endurance matchups wanting to cut it because I don't want to run the risk of having to attack with a Channeler and my opponent just getting like a free endurance, nuke my board, and kill my Channeler. It's not great in the blue-red X mirrors when your opponent's got like Lightning Bolts and Unholy Heats. They're bringing in Unlicensed Hearse, and it just dies to absolutely everything. And then again, that point where you hit Delirium and you can't clear off the opposing board and the Channeler just has to suicide into something is always really rough. 3 copies of Ledger Shredder. I've been everywhere from like 2 to 4, and I'm not convinced that 3 is right, but I don't like seeing 2 or 3 of them in a match. So 4, I'm not a big fan of, and I need a higher threat count than just like 14 or 13 with 4 Shadow, 4 Ragavan, 3 Murktide, 2 Shredder. So I'm kind of on 3 at the moment. It's going to take more games to really come up with a decisive number. The 2 Terminates, really there for opposing Murktide decks that I think are going to jump up in popularity a bit as we see a decline in the 4 color piles. Less Leyline bindings makes Murktide better. So I want to make sure I've got that covered. 3 copies of our own Murktide. So this is like that payoff. This is that big bomb creature that Shadow hasn't necessarily had, that lets us get from point A, opponents at 18, 19 life, to point B, opponents dead, quickly and efficiently. There's a lot of games where you just play out Murktide as like a 2 mana 5/5 flyer. And honestly, that's usually good enough if you back it up with a counter spell or like a spell pierce and a removal spell, something like that. And so it can carry a lot of weight for what seemingly doesn't look that exciting without like Dragon's Rage Channeler and stuff. In the sideboard, 2 copies of Mystical Dispute. Again, mostly for opposing Murktide decks. Also really good against like the 4 color pile still hanging around. Counters to Fairy, Omnath really efficiently, opposing Dress Downs, Expressive Iterations, any of that stuff. 2 Dress Downs. I know it nombos with Murktide, but sometimes you just have to have that effect. Like against opposing Saga decks. And usually you're not playing like a Dress Down into turn, knowing that you're going to untap and play a Murktide. So it's not that that combative. 2 copies of Flusterstorm, mostly for like Expressive Iteration, or not Expressive Iteration, Indomitable Creativity decks that usually are running Expressive Iteration. 1 Alpine Moon for a lot of the Urza Saga stuff. 1 Kaito Shizuki. Again, like a flex spot that I'm not necessarily thrilled about, especially now that we don't have Channeler in this list. But I wanted something else against like blue-white control, 4 color, anything like that. So I'm still like messing around with that spot. 1 Kolaghan's Command, 1 more Terminate, 2 Engineered Explosives, 2 Unlicensed Hearse. So the biggest issues that we've had with the deck before I start going over the actual matches have been like the mana base. As you see, we've got a basic Swamp and a Blood Crypt that don't play very well with Counterspell. And at least for me, I draw these way more often than I would like to. I've tried messing around with like a Grixis Triome instead of the Blood Crypt. It was really slow and clunky. I tried messing around with a no basic Swamp, but I want the basic Swamp in case of Blood Moon. Honestly, I think there's just not a good way around it. Like, you have to fetch up your blue sources pretty aggressively in the early game. And then if these come down on like turn 3, 4, 5, then it's fine. You don't really care. But playing out one of these on turn 1 or 2 feels really bad. So if anybody's got any suggestions there, more than happy to hear about it. But like every time I've cut the Blood Crypt and just added in another fetch, I found myself in a position where I needed the Blood Crypt. So like, you basically just have to have it for when you need it. But most of the time you don't want it. All right. So let's go ahead and hop into the matches. I believe this looks like the first one. All right. So we're on the draw. Opening hand's decent. We've got like turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Counterspell. We've got our double blue, so we can get Murktide down. If we find another fetch or another shock, another Thoughtseize, we can get Shadow down. So, reasonable hand. Like, not having the red front Holy Heat on the draw against a potential Ragavan is rough, but if we draw any, like, fetch land or something, then we can heat. Alright, so opponent revealed a Kahira and played Misty. So, initial thought is that we were right. Our opponents are running 4-color elementals already and just like updating that way. So lead on the Watery Grave because I want a Thoughtseize. If I lead on this Bloodstained Mire, I'd have to get a Blood Crypt, which means I can't have Counterspell on turn 2. Or I can't Thoughtseize on 1 and have Counterspell on turn 2. Like I could get Steam Vents, but then I can't Thoughtseize. So gotta lead with Watery Grave. Alright. So looking at the hand, I'm assuming it's not elementals because we see Supreme Verdict, Leyline Binding, and Fire and Ice. Like, Counterspell could be elementals. Solitude would be. But it looks like it's just straight up like blue-white control. So, we've got a few options here. Solitude is definitely best removal spell against us because, like, exiling a Murktide means we probably can't cast a Shadow. Supreme Verdict is great. There are a couple lands off of it, and it's uncounterable, which is unfortunate. Leyline Binding is obviously really good interaction. Counterspell is great. But I'm going to end up taking the Counterspell here, mostly because I want to make sure that if I do find a way to get down this Shadow, that I can resolve it. My fear is that if one of my creatures gets taken out by a Counterspell and they just have like ridiculously good removal afterwards, then I'm going to be in too much of a disadvantage. But if I take the Counterspell, maybe I can find like another piece of interaction, another Thoughtseize or something, take another removal spell, have Counterspell for something, and just like force them into having to cast Supreme Verdict on 4. And if I do that, then maybe I can follow it up with another threat, and that'll kind of carry me a bit. Forgot to get this over. All right, that might make things easier to see. Just make sure lined up. Opponent does find their second land. Looks like they're going to try to ice me down on turn 2. Ice was another consideration, just so they couldn't do this play and draw a card. But ultimately, like, this is okay. Get my Bloodstained Mire out there because I'm not holding up Counterspell this turn anyway. So I'm leading on my least impactful threat here. Just to try to get some sort of interaction used on it so that I can like protect these shadows and Murktide and stuff. If my opponent untaps and like bounces Ledger Shredder with a Planeswalker, then I do have Unholy Heat, so I'm not like that bad a shape. Find a Prismatic Ending, which is okay. It does mean they're like tapped down a bit. So we still know they have Solitude, Leyline Binding, and Supreme Verdict in hand. But since I've been drawing these extra threats, now I have like a rollout of one creature at a time to kind of deal with these interactive pieces. I feel like they should have gone for the Leyline binding there. Like, I'm guessing they were afraid of Spell Pierce, but instead they go 5th land shocked in, which just means like Solitude's pretty much a given. And then they decide to Leyline binding instead, so I just let that go because I need to fight over this Solitude. I don't really need to fight over the Leyline binding. But we'll fight over a card advantage engine. Mostly because this means that if they decide to Solitude, they have to 2-for-1 themselves to do it. So we know their hand is just Kahira now. And obviously dealing with just Kahira is a lot easier than dealing with most other things. Expressive Iteration, really good draw. Expressive Iteration into Fetch Land, even better draw. So get Steam Vents so we can hold up Lightning Bolt, kind of bluff a... what's it called? Spell Pierce. Find Teferi, get Kahira. But this is fine. We can just like kill a couple things or kill Teferi, get Shadow down. Now we have Counterspell up. And I'm just letting them use up some of this removal here so that I can get down Murktide next turn and hold up Counterspell and just make it like a 2-turn clock to end the game. Like, if they don't have a counter right here, or if they do have a counter, I've got a counter back. But if they just don't have a way to answer a Murktide and can't beat this one counter spell, then I run away with it. So they did have another copy of Leyline Binding. Get that out of here. Opponent finds nothing. If they'd found an answer for Murktide, I assume they would have just cast it on their turn. But Counterspell is fine. And take that one. We could have like played Ledger Shredder first into Counterspell or something. But I really just don't want to commit more to the board. If my opponent does end up playing like a Supreme Verdict here, then I could follow up next turn with the Ledger Shredder plus a 5/5 Murktide and get a Connive trigger. So just kind of holding back a little bit to make sure we've got gas in the tank after. All right. Game number 2. So sideboarding against blue-white control. This build, I really went heavy on like boarding out most of my interactions. So like the 2 Terminates, 3 Unholy Heats, Lightning Bolt, boarded out a Murktide Regent because they had Dress Down, Solitude, Teferi, Leyline Binding. Like, they've got a ton of ways of dealing with a Murktide, and the second one is almost always going to be dead. So instead of drawing 2, we just cut 1. Board ends. We got... Let's see, boarded in the 2 Mystical Disputes, the 2 Fluster Storms, Seasoned Pyromancer, Kaito, K-Command, and I believe that's everything. So a bunch of like the grindy pieces. All right, opening hand, we've got Thoughtseize into Counterspell with a Murktide and a Fluster Storm, so can't ask for too much more. Only other thing would be if this island were like an expressive iteration, but that's really kind of nitpicking there. All right. Usually I say just fire off the Thoughtseize here, but it seems like every time I play against blue-white, they've got the Veil of Summer on turn 1. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to pass here. Like, there's nothing they do on turn 2 that I'm that concerned about. Chalice of the Void could be a little annoying, but I do have, like, Counterspell Murktide. Flusterstorms get around Chalice to an extent, so it's not, like, a horrendous spot to be in, but I feel like if my opponent does drop a Veil of Summer on my turn 1 Thoughtseize, then all of a sudden I'm, like, really behind. Plus, if I hold up this fetch land on turn 1, maybe they just don't go for it expecting like a Spell Pierce. But they're going to fire off a counter spell here on a Thoughtseize. I'm 100% Flusterstorming this. Like, you either got something relevant or you got nothing. Either way, I want to know. So, Fire and Ice, Teferi, Solitude. Pretty easy. Teferi takes. They can't just untap and play that. Teferi absolutely, like, wrecks our world, so. Alright, so I decided to Flusterstorm this Fire and Ice, mostly just to stop the card draw. Like, I've got really good hands, or cards in hand. As long as I can get Murktide down in a position to protect it with Counterspell, like, I feel okay. Obviously, Solitude's a big pain, but my opponent's pretty low on cards. And if they're just doing like this and adding Kahira to the hand to be able to evoke the Solitude, then I've got a reasonable chance of being able to fight. I think I end up, like, fetching first. Because I just don't want to get caught in a situation where, like, I need to fetch to counterspell, but they can just, like, evoke Solitude. Let's pop this out a little bit. Going ahead and exiling like all spells to Murktide because I'm trying to fight over keeping this Murktide on the board. If I had like a second Murktide and I was pretty okay with this one dying, I would keep a spell in the yard, but and then the counterspell here kind of so if they do decide to go for the Solitude, they just have to like exile a card from their hand. But now I just get to untap and Spyro. Ragavan K command's pretty decent. And since they don't have a 5th land yet, I'm not worried about like evoking Solitude. We just exiled a Subtlety, but the odds are pretty low that they would have drawn like back-to-back Subtleties. Now we get it to Teferi and like feel pretty decent with the Teferi in hand, drawing into an expressive iteration with a Ragavan dashing. So prismatic ending there to Teferi. So here we're just gonna go for K command while they're tapped down, make them ditch one. Do end up ditching a Solitude, which is obviously very nice for us. Get in our attack. Now we're just looking for like counter spells and things like that. Finding another iteration is fine. Give us it's like if our opponent does have Supreme Verdict here or something, then we just get to rebuild with like iteration, dashed Ragavan. We got Fiery Islet to draw a card. We'll have tokens, off-season Pyromancer. So ultimately, we got like plenty of good stuff going for us. So Ice is fine. I decided to go for the Spell Pierce just to like tap them down completely. The most problematic cards for me at this point are like another Solitude, Supreme Verdict, things that I can't Spell Pierce anyway. So if I can just like get them to tap down off this, then maybe I can find like one of my 2 remaining bolts off Expressive Iteration and just have lethal and they have no way of interacting with it. But we'll just take a bunch of counter spells. And I'm just going to pass holding up this counter spell. It's like, you have to beat what's on board. You're probably going to have to tap off a lot of mana to beat what's on board, which means I get to untap and just have like Ragavan hold up counter spell. So I highly doubt there's a combination they can come up with that beats all 3 things. All right, match number 2. Got another opponent revealing Kahira, which could be elementals, could be blue-white control. If it's elementals, this hand is really good. If it's blue-white control, this hand is okay. Don't want to bobble. Don't want to bobble before I fetch. I could bobble them, but doesn't matter too much. I'm not going to be able to take the card. Kind of the same thing as game 1. Take the counter spell. Make sure that I can like resolve this Expressive Iteration. I've got Bolt or Unholy Heat for Narset. And then the other one can take out Subtlety. Alright. Find a Shadow, which is perfect. Since they didn't Subtlety, I'm kind of looking at just bolting myself here. I know it's not the greatest use of cards, but sometimes you just kind of have to push the advantage. And we're going to throw down Murktide here. Honestly, I'm just hoping to get this Subtlety out of hand. And the fact that like they just take out their only 2 live cards that I know about to Subtlety the Murktide is like great for me. I'll just throw that on the bottom. I know you've got 3 out of your 4 cards are lands in hand. Like there's a reasonable chance that they'll find an answer to the Shadow, but if they do, I've got the Expressive Iteration. So I thought about dashing the Ragavan to kill the Teferi, but I really wanted to get that Thoughtseize. Just like turn 4 is a pretty crucial spot. It's like you really don't want your opponent untapping and getting like a Jace or something. Odoar, my monkey. Now, if they've used that, we're pretty okay just saying, like, cool, we're going to get down our Shadow. We've got Dash Monkey in the wing. Now it's kind of like game 1 or game 2 against the last blue-white opponent where we're going to see if Ragavan backed up by counterspell is enough to kind of carry us. We know they've got Kahira in hand, and that's the only card we know about. So if they're not playing Kahira here, I have to assume that their other card is something live. Not really worried about a direct burn spell. But it could be like a Solitude that they're sitting on. Which it looks like is exactly what it is. Alright. So they've got Kahira and an unknown. Shadow's a really good pickup. Dress down my Ragavan. Pretty okay with that. Like, the blind Days Undoing flip me into just like counter spells galore. Backup Ragavan, find expressive iteration. Like, pretty happy with how that played out. I do get a little punished here. I'll show why. They had this Solitude. I probably should have just ditched the extra Ragavan. So if they did find a Solitude off the Days Undoing and exiled my Shadow, I could Thoughtseize afterwards. But wasn't that high on my mind. And here, my entire goal is just hold up counter spells. Like, I can fight over a little bit. I've got this Ledger Shredder providing lethal next turn. I've got expressive iterations to rebuild. I've still got 2 more lightning bolts in the deck. I've got the Dash Ragavan. So, like, my opponent has to beat the Ledger Shredder on board, the 2 counter spells protecting the Ledger Shredder, and then me untapping and having a Dashed Ragavan plus 2 expressive iterations to try to help find a bolt. So, pretty good chunk of stuff they gotta fight through. Sideboarding, pretty much exactly the same. Board out the Heat to Lightning Bolt that terminates 1 Murktide. Bring in anything that looks like it's remotely good against blue-white control. Opening hand on the draw suffers from, I really hope I don't miss my second land drop syndrome. But that's kind of the name of the game with Shadow. It's really not a good keep. Like, Murktide's so far from coming online. Spyro's a couple lands off. K-Command's a couple lands off. Shadow needs more ways of lowering my life total. Like, this hand is so much just Ragavan or bust. I'm really hoping that I just find my second land so I can start getting these counter spells to, like, hold me over. At least, like, fight over a Teferi or something here. So, just goes to show you, like, don't keep 1-landers and hope that it's going to get you there. Unless you've got, like, a bunch of baubles or street wraiths or something. But, I mean, I recognize completely that this was, like, a very, very greedy keep. That's the joy of leagues. Like, I always suggest kind of pushing the limits in leagues. See what you can get away with. And right back to a 1-lander. It is a 1-lander with Shadow, Flusterstorm, Thoughtseize, and a couple more 2-drops, especially one that helps find more lands. But I'm just going to not risk it. Like, I would have been a lot more okay with that 1-land 7-hand as opposed to the one in game 2. But this one is, like, way better than both of them. Like, I've got Ragavan Thoughtseize. I've got multiple redraws. I'm just going to decide to, like, keep the action. Like, I've got a bauble. I am bobbling myself here because I would rather see the second land than play the Ragavan. So, like, now that I don't see the second land, we can just jam the Ragavan. But if I had seen, which I see Spell Pierce, shuffle it away, and still draw into one. But I guess that's kind of like the joy of having 3 of them. And do get the second land, thankfully. Thoughtseize and see double Chalice of the Void, Solitude, and a few lands. Mystic Gate we did not know about, so now we have Spell Pierce, a Chalice. Finding a third land is nice. So now pretty much our entire deck is open. Didn't know about the Narset, so we'll go ahead and take care of that. So now it's Solitude, Scalding Tarn. And Spyro off the top is S tier draw. Scalding Tarn down, Solitude, Kahira, Unknown. Alright, too many lands now. And I'm going to kind of wait on this Murktide so that maybe I might be able to find like a counter spell or a Thoughtseize or something to protect it. They're going for the upkeep Solitude here. That means I'm pretty confidently like throwing down the Murktide. Thoughtseize catches a Verdict, so now my Murktide is protected from the board at least. And they immediately find another copy of Solitude. Kaido's not great here. Kaido's like fantastic if it's an empty board, or better yet, you just have like a Ragavan or a Channeler Shredder, something on board that can attack. But Kaido just on a straight empty board is pretty rough. Alright, so we find Shadow, we've got a counter spell backup. Not in a terrible spot. And opponent's got a Teferi. Well, we have to counter that or we die. And another Prismatic Ending. So, opponent's last 4 draw steps were Prismatic Ending, Teferi, second Solitude, Supreme Verdict. Not a whole lot you can do against that. Like, we could have picked up Kaido last turn, not attacked. We would have flipped over the Spell Pierce, drawn the Expressive Iteration to find Shadow plus Counterspell, play out the Shadow, have the Counterspell, and it would be untapped Ninja versus this. So we could like block the Solitude, take 7, go to 1, untap, play Shadow, have Spell Pierce, but we would still need to find another interactive spell. Because we'd be dead on board right there. We'd have like Kaido tick up, but we would just have like a Shadow on board, whatever we drew for that turn against these 3. So, not exactly a better spot. But sometimes Moto decides that you are not going to win a game. Match number 3. We're on the play. Always good to be on the play. Opening hand's reasonable. We've got a threat. We've got some digging. We've got an interactive spell. We've got our lands. Opponent's on a mulligan. Bloodstained Mire for Blood Crypt, and Scam. Okay, so they got rid of the Terminate, which is nice for us. But we do just have like double iteration to help find a little bit more. This Grief is solid, but it's not like an unbeatable clock or anything. All the iterations. All right, so we find Lightning Bolts. We've got an answer to the Grief now. And I'm going to go for the Bolt on their upkeep. So they can have an Undying effect, but they'd have an Undying effect on my instep if I bolted on my turn anyway. So instead, we'll make them use it on their turn. So if they get back this Grief, it does have Summoning Sickness. But at least that's what I should have done. Instead, we just go to combat and bolt. Yep. It is interesting that they had the Undying effects in like the right sequence. I don't know if they had them in hand or if they were like drawing into them or what. But with these Undying effects, for example, Undying Evil gives a creature Undying. So if it's already got a 1/1 counter off of like Undying Malice or Feign Death, then Undying Evil doesn't work. Because if it's already got a +1/+1 counter, it doesn't trigger Undying and won't come back. But because it had Undying Evil first and the Undying Malice second, then it does get to make a return. Alright, so I was hoping Expressive Iteration would hit a land. But we do at least find Terminate, so... Blood Moon is not great for us. We do have a reasonable amount of red-based removal, so we're not, like, out of it. We have basic Swamp, so... Question is, do they have another Undying effect? And they do. And again, it's like the Feign Death and the Undying Malice after the Undying Evil is huge. If that Undying Evil had been at any point later than the other two, then we would have had this Grief off the board a while ago. But either way, opponent's going to untap. They're going to get back their dude, and we just like don't find the basic. And that's about all there is to the rest of that game. Game 2, good opening hand. We've got answers to an Undying creature, answers to like a Undying Evil effect. We've got a backup in case they have Grief. So let's say go. Best case scenario would have been opponent went for like a turn 1 scam on a Fury. So Unholy Eat's fine, but I don't really want it. I'd rather find like a threat at this point. Especially with my opponent tapped out here, and I know I'm going to get an attack in. Get basic Swamp to help play around Blood Moon. Ragavan getting treasures here helps a lot with that as well. So, and then next turn I can like just fetch up basic Island with Scalding Tarn. And then I'm not perfect against Blood Moon, but I'm fairly insulated. All right, so they take my Bolt, dash into Ragavan. So we're gonna have little Ragavan on Ragavan action. Yet again, it's always funny that it's clockwork that my Ragavans hit dead and my opponent's Ragavans hit something. So here I'm just hard casting the Ragavan so I can keep holding up like Spell Pierce. If my opponent has like a Blood Moon here, I really want to Spell Pierce. Bolt my Shredder, get down Dolthy and Ragavan. Can terminate the Ragavan because Terminate's going to be the only card exiled with a Void counter on my side. My opponent can't block the Ragavan. If they do decide to sack the Dolthy and go for the Terminate, then I've got counter spell, so Ragavan hits dead. That is exactly what they do. Immediately go for the Dolthian to terminate. And if they're doing that, then I have to assume that they just like don't have another threat in hand. Or not another threat, another interactive spell. But I am thinking they have a Fury here. And they're just gonna like Fury my Fury. But Spyro is not Fury. Get a chump out of the way. Unfortunately, with these Spyros, they do just have like a large stream of chump blockers. But we're going to dress down this Grief so that we know we get to keep attacking with this Fury. I mean, we'd attack anyway, but you get the idea. Attack with both since we have the backup Ragavan now. And I do appreciate the aggression out of them here. Like they've got a bunch of Spyro tokens. Got Furies and Ragavans and stuff. Let's throw out a double block. Undying Malice is fine. Like, the important part is that the Shadow's still alive. Don't care too much about the Ragavan with all the tokens that my opponent can make. Braid will throw off a Spell Pierce to either make them counter it or either pay the 2 or it gets countered. Either way, it's fantastic with me. If they pay the 2, then I just get to fetch, shock, Spell Pierce it again. And then I've got 2 lethal attackers. If they don't pay for it, then I just got Spell Pierce up for the next thing. Kind of an all roads lead to Rome sort of scenario. Forgot to talk about sideboarding for this matchup. Boarded out a bunch of Thoughtseizes. Like, Thoughtseizes is okay because they have a bunch of good payoffs. But because they're a heavy Thoughtseize and Grief deck, the chances of me having a Thoughtseize and them not having a Thoughtseize for my Thoughtseize effect is pretty low. So if that's the case, I would rather lean on like my interaction instead of leaning on my Thoughtseize, especially since these are going to get dead as the game goes on. And then board out like a Ragavan on the draw, a Counterspell, and a Murktide on the draw, just because so much is going on like turns 1 or 2 that a lot of these cards are really dead early. boarded in all my 2-for-1. So like the Dress Downs, Kaido, Seasoned Pyromancer, K Command, the Terminates. All right. One lander on the draw with the bauble. But I do have like all of my good interaction. Because they're pretty aggressively scamming. And if they're doing that, then I want to keep a pretty interactive creature hand. I do think it's good practice to uh, not take lines or make plays that you wouldn't make in normal situations. And the reason I say that is like here, my opponent invokes a grief. Before their first trigger resolves, they go ahead and Undying Malice it. But you just don't know my hand. Like if I'm sitting here with 3 lightning bolts, let's say 4 lands, 3 lightning bolts, then this play gives up a lot of equity to in a situation that like goes all in on the grief, because you just gave up like grief, push, Undying Malice to try to get like bolt, terminate or something out of hand, which is like pretty high risk, high reward. I would always let this check out their hand trigger resolve first, so you can know if it's actually worth it to Undying Malice. So I am checking out my own hand there, or my own deck there, mainly because if they do have like a Thoughtseize, I've got backup Terminate, but mostly because I'm giving myself Delirium here. So if I saw an not Expressive Iteration, Unholy Heat, I'd want to be able to cast it on their upkeep. All right. And now's the fun part of mismatching Moto arts. So I'm having to remember like which terminates do they know about, which one do they not know about. Does the set symbol on this one match this one, or am I giving away information? So I do not have another Undying effect, thankfully. Ragavan's reasonable. I'm assuming they've got a Blood Moon here if they're getting these basics. So I'm actually going to go for the token there, the treasure token, so they can't like hard cast a Fury or something. Mainly so if I find a threat, it's not like under a lot of duress. Decide not to Expressive Iteration, mainly because if I Iteration, I have to tap off of Counterspell here. And I think the Counterspell's got a little more utility. Point in case. But now it was more of like I can cast anything that I find off Iteration. If I find another land, that's good. Alright. Hardcast Ragavan, no follow-up. Really makes me think that they've got a Fury in hand. And then I was really surprised with this block. Like, even if you have an Undying Malice effect, I think you just take 6 there. And, like, be fine with that. I don't think there's a lot to be gained by making that block. And again, I'm like so convinced that their last card is just a Fury here. I think everything they've played so far is kind of at least suggested that's the case. So if they do just like hard cast a Fury, kill the Ledger Shredder, then I would get to like Unholy Heat it, dash Ragavan. But it could be possible that they don't. That just seems like the card that made the most sense to me. But if they did, maybe they were supposed to evoke it off the Ragavan and Undying Malice and just say, like, here's a 4/4 double striker that you have to deal with or it kills you. But either way, that's game number 3. So we are on to match 4. Currently 2-1. Win a die roll, always nice. Good opening hand. We've got double blue. We've got Steam Vents for Ragavan on 1. Tempo out with counter spells after that. So this is the kind of hand that really makes this deck feel like Murktide. Like, hey, if my opponent can't answer the turn 1 Ragavan, then I know I'm going to get in like 2 or 3 hits with it because I've got the protective spells behind it. And if that's the case, I give myself a bunch of chances of like drawing something off of my opponent's deck, which would obviously be fantastic. But it looks like it's creativity. Proving Ground into Stomping Ground with a Wrenn just means like double Mountain Wrenn. I mean, it could be just like Jund mid-range, but I don't think Jund has been popular enough recently for me to really have it like on the forefront of consideration. And that, I don't think that's a Jund mid-range card, but I could be wrong. Let's get down Shadow, and we'll just sit here on double counterspell right now. If our opponent goes for like a Bolt or an Unholy Heat or something on Shadow, then we can Bolt ourselves. But otherwise, we're just sitting on double counterspell, which we will definitely counterspell something that gives them a blocker. All right, and I thought about bolting myself here. But because we're on giving them a 2-turn clock and I have a removal spell for a blocker, I'm just going to hold up Counterspell and bolt. So, like, if they play out anything that makes a dude, I can bolt it. If they play out anything that kills one of my guys, I can Counterspell it. And blah, 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 blah. On to game 2. Sideboarding is pretty straightforward. Like, I'm taking out most of my 1-for-1 interaction. Ragavan gets eaten up by Wrenn and 6 or Lightning Bolt very easily, so I want to trim on those. Trim on Murktide because if my opponent does have like Teferi and Mystical Dispute to fight over that, then I really don't want to cast the second one. Board ends are like the 2 Engineered Explosives, the 2 Flusterstorms, 2 Mystical Disputes. So 2 Dispute, 2 Flusterstorm, 2 EE. Yeah, that's about it. We're just heavy becoming the control deck post-board. Hand's not bad. It's got a redraw with Bobble. Got a counterspell effect, but I don't know if this is good enough to beat a reasonable creativity hand. So we ship that. This kind of the same situation. It's not great, but I'm on the draw. If I hit another land, then the hand really opens up, and I really don't want to keep mulliganing. Second land is great. And now we're just hoping to dodge Ren on turn 2. If we dodge Ren, I think we like run away with this one potentially. Especially now that we found the Spell Pierce. Alright, so shocking third land pass almost undoubtedly means Prismari command. So we're just going to play the control role here. Very, very heavily. And we get super rewarded with just 3 straight fetch lands off the top. So now we're going to go on a bit of a fetching spree, get down to Shadow. Only getting down 1 so I can hold up like triple interactive pieces. If I need to like creativity or Flusterstorm or creativity, and then like Spell Pierce if they have a follow-up Flusterstorm or something. Or like Mystical Dispute it to Fairy plus Spell Pierce something. Like counterspell a Fable of the Mirror Breaker and have a Flusterstorm for their Flusterstorm. Anything like that. So Fable, let's deal with that. Still have Spell Pierce up for anything. Mystical Dispute this ice just so I can like start really getting pressure going. Like I need to get my opponent dead as fast as possible. The interactive spells are great, but ultimately they're not like a certified win. So if they're just making a dwarf and passing, I have to assume their hand is like either more fire and ices or Archon, something like that. Maybe like Archon and persist, and they just don't have an outlet to discard one. But either way, now that I've picked up another counterspell, like I feel in reasonable shape. Mario Command's fine, because if they do flip over an Archon, like, I can fight over a Persist all day. I'm A-okay just going, like, Counterspell, Flusterstorm, Flusterstorm. But either way, they scoop it up there. I think that having such a good creativity matchup is one of the primary reasons to play a list like this. Like, our percentage against creativity. If I can pull up the matchup list real quick. Yeah, I didn't even include that last one there, but our percentage against creativity has been, like, through the roof. What else did we play this league? We played Scam. We played Blue-White Control. We won 1. We lost 1. Update the last one after this round. All right, so match number 5. We're currently 3-1. Good Shadow opening hand, like Thoughtseize into Thoughtseize Shadow with a removal spell. So, and our opponent's on a mulligan. We'll take it. Amulet Titan. With a basic island and a Hydroid Grixis in hand. We'll take the Dryad to try to slow them down a little bit. Valakut's gone. Don't want to draw another fetch land. So let's get Thoughtseize. We'll go ahead and take the Primeval Titan here. If they like Hydroid Grixis for 1 or something on turn 4, then we've got Unholy Heat, but ultimately it's not like that big of a deal. But since we pick up this Thoughtseize, then I know I'm going to be able to like clear out this Tribe Elder, Thoughtseize them. I should have shocked in Ledger Shredder plus Unholy Heat the Tribe Elder to get the Connive trigger. I probably wouldn't have thrown away the Thoughtseize if I drew something else, but I should have just gone ahead and gotten the other threat on board. But I kind of wanted to get the damage in. And the only way to get the guaranteed 6 damage was to Thoughtseize and Unholy Heat the Tribe Elder to clear it out. But it looks like opponents just drawing like a bunch of lands. As they still got nothing that we know about. A Titan off the top loses to the Ledger Shredder, so that's not the biggest deal. If they have 2 Summoners Pact, will Spell Pierce make them pay the 2 more if they can't get a Titan. If they have a Dryad of the Elysian Grove, they get double bolts off that if they have 2 land drops. So they could, like, double bolt the Shadow, but they die to Ledger Shredders. They could bolt the 2 Shredders. Then they're on chump block duty on the Shadow. They can bolt me twice, but I'm still alive, so that wouldn't be like the worst deal in the world. Sideboarding against Amulet Titan. Spell Pierces are coming out pretty aggressively. And then board out some of the 1-mana interaction, mainly because it doesn't kill, like Lightning Bolt doesn't kill Dryad or Titan. Unholy Heat can kill Titan, but I really want to try to formulate my game plan around like not letting Titan resolve, whether that be through Thoughtseizes or counter spells or anything like that. The board ends. Bringing in like 1 EE, the K command, mainly because with the addition of Urza's Saga, they're way more reliable at like getting an amulet out. So I want a little extra interaction for Amulet itself, plus like Engineered Explosive fights over construct tokens. Bring in the Alpine Moon, because it's great for naming anything from Saga to bounce lands to the haste land, whichever haste land they choose to play. And bring in the 2 Dress Downs to stop Titan ETBs, shut off Dryad for a turn, anything like that. Another good Shadow hand. It's like, I'm really glad to see the Shadow half of the potential hands instead of the Murktide half against Amulet. Because usually the best way that you can beat Amulet is hand disruption backed up by like a quick clock. And Shadow does that pretty much better than anything else. So Terminate's a good pickup to be able to take care of a Titan down the road. We've got double Titan and a Dryad. Decide to take the Titan so that I can potentially terminate the second one. Or terminate the Dryad, either way. But picking up this second Thoughtseize is like fantastic here. Because now I just get to get down a Shadow, say go. So I know their hand is Vesuva Unknown. Vesuva's just going to give them a little extra mana. Whipping on a land there kind of hurts. But they do have this Urza's Saga off the top, which I can interact with Alpine Moon. So they haven't played their last card, which makes me assume that their last card is another land. They've played 2 land drops every turn. So let's go ahead and take out Saga. And I decided just to hold up Terminate here. Mainly so if my opponent top decks a Titan or a way to get Titan and gets Valakuts, then I can kill the Dryad. The other alternative was just playing out a 6/6 Murktide, which would have been fine. but it looks like they probably top deck this Sun Home here, which means we're just gonna terminate the Dryad and call it a day. We don't care if they titan into the Sun Home being on board, as long as they're not tightening into a haste land. So here we're just going to throw down Murktide. Could have thrown down the other Shadow, but I didn't want to expose it to a potential EE off the top. Like if my opponent just went EE, blow up both our Shadows. I know I'd have Bolt to kill, but they've got 2 unknowns. So like, I know about the Crumbling Vestige. I feel like I don't need to throw this Lightning Bolt out there. Or not throw the Lightning Bolt, throw the Shadow out there. And they get this Flying Death Touch thing, which I think I saw Mistaken like Kura, but either way, our big flying beater is better than their medium-sized flying beater. So get there, nice little 4-1. So we beat Amulet Titan, we beat Blue-White Control once, lost to Blue-White once, beat Scam, and beat Creativity. So yeah, again, I think this deck's like a reasonable choice if you're expecting to play against a bunch of unfair stuff. It's not going to be as good against like Hammer Time and like Zoo and things like that are getting under Counterspell, where Drown and Lock being a removal spell would be very live. But it's a solid choice. I think if you're really wanting like a more control-y variation of Grixis Shadow, then this could be an option that works well for you. But we'll probably be live sometime pretty soon to go over some of the changes over at Twitch, twitch.tv/the_control freak. So if you want to come check out a live stream, feel free to hop on over. Otherwise, hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. Catch y'all back alive later. Adios for now.